Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, it's Friday. I don't know about you, Jim. This feels like one of those weeks that it took about a month to get through just because of the avalanche of news from campuses and Biden stumbling all over just about every issue and Kristi Noem. And doesn't Kristi Noem feel like about a month ago at this point?
God, this week has been a long year. I guess you could say Noem is measuring it in dog years.
Well, speaking of Kristi Noem, she had been thought to be among the names being considered by Donald Trump to be his running mate this time around. That doesn't appear to be the case anymore, which I would suggest is probably the right call. Also not on the list, to no one's surprise, Mike Pence, who was Trump's running mate in 2016 and 2020, and as of yet, I don't believe has endorsed Donald Trump. Obviously, he's not going to beat Trump's choice. So according to reporting from Bloomberg and some other places, as of right now, the Trump VP list is down to Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota. We're done with South Dakota, but we're still got North Dakota in the running. Doug Burgum, of course, briefly ran for president. He's independently wealthy, very popular in North Dakota. He got himself on the debate stage by asking for $1 donations in exchange for $20 gift cards, which actually worked twice. And I
remember, this man is a fiscal conservative. Fiscal conservative.
And don't forget that he also appeared at the first debate after either tearing his Achilles or blowing an ACL playing basketball the day before. So he's a gamer. The other names, Marco Rubio, who everybody knows, now in his third term as a senator from Florida, known as Little Marco back during the 2016 campaign, but it seems they've made up. So Marco Rubio on the short list. J.D. Vance, who among ardent Trump supporters, they certainly see J.D. Vance as the most ideologically similar to Donald Trump. And the fourth name is Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, who, of course, ran for president and did not do even as well as I expected. I didn't expect him to get the nomination, but he never really got much momentum. I still love Tim Scott. I think he's a great guy, and his happy warrior attitude could be an asset. I don't know how much he adds to the ticket on Election Day. I think he'd be a good vice president. So, Jim, of these names, and who knows if these are the actual names, I think it would probably be Burgum or Scott, because I don't know that you attract anyone else if you go with J.D. Vance, because they are so ideologically similar. Marco Rubio runs into the 12th Amendment unless Trump decides to move, because the 12th Amendment says the electors, the Electoral College, that means, shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president, one of whom at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. So a lot of people argue that if it were to be two Florida candidates, they couldn't win Florida's electoral votes, which would kind of be an important thing for the Republican ticket. Assuming they can deal with that, like Dick Cheney did by pretending he lived in Wyoming again in 2000 when he ran with George W. Bush. What do you make of these four, and do you think this actually is the final four?
Well, we should note that folks in the Trump campaign have said, if you think you know who Trump is going to pick, you don't know, and don't listen to anybody speculating unless the person's named Donald Trump. So it wouldn't shock me if Trump ultimately selects somebody besides these four. But if these are indeed the final four, or currently the strongest four, or something like that, it's an intriguing list. And you know, words I did not expect to say, Greg. Governor Burgum might be the most intriguing name on that list, in part because he's so normal. He's so, he's like if you want a balanced ticket, well, we all know Donald Trump. We all know his personality. We all know his approach to the job. And Doug Burgum is, you could say boring, but also reliable, level-headed, even-keeled. Yes, I have a soft spot for somebody who tries to play through an Achilles injury. For anybody who's like, the Nikki Haley voters who are, I can't deal with another 4 years of Trump. I can't stand Biden. But Doug Burgum, he might be, ironically, be the most Mike Pence-y guy on this list, the most solid, reliable, conservative guy who could say, hey, Reaganite conservatism is not gone. Talked a lot about wanting to develop America's energy resources. It's also entirely possible, Burgum ends up Secretary of the Interior or something like that. But sounds like Trump likes him, and Trump sees him as businesslike and professional, and that maybe Trump kind of recognizes that somebody who has strengths where his weaknesses are and vice versa might be very useful for him. So, look, that's a really intriguing choice. Rubio, you mentioned the state residency thing, and ordinarily you're like, okay, we'll just have one of these guys move. That's what happened between Bush and Dick Cheney. I believe Cheney was legally registered to vote in Texas, and then he, changed to one of his other properties that he had in Wyoming, and they made the constitutional requirement. You might say, oh, okay, well, Rubio could do that, except Rubio is currently a senator from Florida. I don't know if he would get into any legal headaches over being legally registered to vote in some other state. I assume, but also this is assuming Rubio has some other property somewhere in some other state. I mean, if you need to, you just go out and, buy rent an apartment or something. But that is kind of an odd glitch to have. You'd think all the polling kind of looks like Florida looks pretty safe. I don't think you necessarily need Rubio, but I do think considering where Rubio and Trump started, Rubio does broaden the appeal. And also it's kind of interesting that Rubio has struck a more populist, certainly an economic nationalist note in his policy worldview over the last couple of years. So this, Rubio has adapted to the Trump era of politics a great deal. An intriguing choice. Now, J.D. Vance, I'd be very surprised if it's J.D. Vance. And while J.D. Vance is not my cup of tea, I actually don't think it's really on that. I think it's very safe to say that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are very much simpatico in their policy worldviews. I just figure if you're Donald Trump, you look at J.D. Vance and say, this guy can do me more good in the Senate as my guy and as a voice for what I believe in the Senate than he could do as vice president. And yeah, I know the vice president, breaks ties in the Senate and things like that. But you kind of feel like when it comes to advancing the Trump agenda, you probably think you might do it. Also, Ohio is looking like a deep red state and not really the sort of swing state that Trump would need any help with. And finally, Tim Scott, one of my favorites. His presidential campaign clearly did not get off the ground. I think what I find most intriguing about Tim Scott, when he ran for president, we saw a hideously ugly response from Democrats on the left. We've seen this pretty much every time Tim Scott is in the national spotlight. He gets called Uncle Tom. He gets called people who are adamantly insist that they are non-racist and anti-racist will attack Tim Scott for the color of his skin in ways that would make 1950s segregationists blush. And there's a part of me that thinks if you're Trump, does that play to your favor? One, the argument that Trump is racist. Well, if he's got an African-American running mate, how racist can the guy be? But then secondly, that if the selection of Tim Scott triggers this frothing at the mouth, nasty, race-based attacks on Tim Scott, does that undermine the Democratic message? And we've already seen that Trump is doing a little better than you're used to seeing Republicans do amongst African Americans. So it's an intriguing choice there. I also kind of noticed it's interesting that none of these are women. And for a while, it sounded like Trump wanted a woman running mate. I think he recognized that the suburban soccer mom types and the waitress moms were a weaker demographic for him. So we'll see how things shake out. I'm very pleased to see that, figures like Carrie Lake are not on this list. So again, take all of this with a grain of salt. It's possible that this list changes, but an intriguing, group of people who will be hanging out with these donors at the Republican National Committee retreat in Palm Beach this weekend.
Yeah, before the Kristi Noem story, it might have been a party of five, and she would have been on there. I imagine Elise Stefanik is not the happiest person seeing this list. It seems like she's been lobbying pretty heavily for the nomination, but doesn't look like it's headed that way. But I wouldn't be surprised to see a female name or two get at least tossed around here in the next couple of months before he has to make a choice in terms of the vice presidential slot. So, as you said, are these actually the names, the final names? We don't know. My guess is it's very much in flux. We'll find out soon enough, but we're getting close. I mean, it's already May, so we're only really 2 months away from convention season. I know you can't wait, Jim. And so this is really the last major mystery of getting this campaign on the general election ballot. So we will see. All right, Jim, on to our bad martini now, and could obviously be a lot worse. There was positive job growth in the month of April, but the number of jobs added did not meet expectations. The expectation was about 250,000 non-farm jobs added in April. It was 175,000 jobs overall. Also, over the past 2 months, the previous 2 months, revised downwards by 22,000, although last month did actually tick up to 315,000. So significant drop from March to April. But the issue here, and I think we're probably still going to get more analysis like we did over the last couple of months about how many of those jobs were part-time and how many were full-time, which was, according to a lot of different analyses, almost all part-time, which is not what you want to see. But now we're taking a close look at the issue of people who aren't even in the labor force. Officially, the unemployment rate ticked up from 3.8 to 3.9%. But E.J. Antoni over at the Heritage Foundation, who takes a very close look at these things, looking at a number of different surveys, the number of people missing from the labor market. He says the gap between today's employment to population ratio, which has been essentially flat since March of 22, and its pre-pandemic trend is equal to a whopping 5.8 million people missing from the labor market. And then there are different surveys, so that number changes some. He says the effect is even worse when you look at the anemic employment level from the household survey. The gap there is a jaw-dropping 7 million people missing from the labor market. And then the establishment survey shows payrolls rising at about the pre-pandemic pace, but it's never made up the lost ground, leaving a gap of 4.7 million. So, I mean, there's just it could be a significant range here, but at the very best scenario, you're missing almost 5 million people from this labor force.
Yeah. As we contemplate the 2024 presidential election, it's May 3rd. I can't tell you who's going to win. I've shifted back and forth. I still feel like it's going to be, pretty close, pretty tight. It's about a 50-50 jump ball. But I have a feeling whoever wins by, the day after the election, we're going to say, oh, yeah, of course, it had to be. It was always going to shake out this way. And by that, I mean, people are going to say, you know what? Donald Trump was always controversial. He'd lost in 2020. Throw January 6th on top of that. Throw him being 4 years older and even more erratic. And then you throw the criminal indictments. Of course, Trump was going to lose. Flip side, if Trump wins and Biden loses, we're going to say, oh, of course, 81 was far too old for a man. He was always old and doddering. The Democratic Party had gone way too far to the left. And I think our perception we will say, and also the state of the economy was not good enough to help reelect an incumbent president. Now, for the last couple of years, remember, Bidenomics, boy, that phrase disappeared really fast. But the attitude for a lot of Democrats was, no, the economy should be a Biden strength, because the unemployment rate is low. Now, 3.9% is still pretty low by historical standards, but it's not as low as it used to be. And as you noted, the number of people who are just not in the workforce is increasing. And as we've talked about many times in this podcast, even though the unemployment rate is low, perceptions of the economy are lousy. Americans are very frustrated with the state of the economy because everything's really expensive. And it's not just because of the inflation rate year over year. It's also because prices went high and stayed high. And keep your eye on gas prices as we head towards Memorial Day and summer driving season. Rents and mortgage costs are higher than ever. Home insurance rates really high. Cars, both new and used. You just throw it. People are really expensive. So now throw the employment situation maybe getting a little bit worse. Again, not terrible, but not getting better. It will further worsen the impressions of the economy, as I keep drilling over and over again. Perceptions of the economy. People ask, what's the most important issue in this election? They keep saying the economy. This is, none of this is good news for Biden. And I have a feeling if Biden loses, we're going to look at this and say, oh yeah, Biden was doomed from the start. Democrats were fools to run him again. And yet, here we are. So we'll see. I don't feel like, again, we're going to say, this jobs report was what did it. But, the Biden record they've been able to point to is like, but look how good the unemployment rate is. And now, all of a sudden, the unemployment rate doesn't quite look as good as it used to. And you throw every other factor in people's perception of the economy. It's a worsening situation for Biden. I suppose if you're pulling for Trump, you could say it's good. But really, I like to see as many Americans working and making a good living as possible. And these numbers are not pointing towards that.
There was 3 incumbents in the White House fired in a 16-year span. Gerald Ford, the economy wasn't great, but that was largely in response to him pardoning Nixon. Carter was definitely about the economy as well as the Iranian hostage crisis. And George H.W. Bush, who had been riding at record levels after the Gulf War, got hit with a recession. That ended up being the main issue in 1992. So if the economy is a dominant issue, it's never good for the incumbent. And the question is, will that be the dominant issue? We have a lot of different things that are occupying the media, occupying the minds of Americans right now. But if that's front and center, that's going to work against Joe Biden, at least historically speaking, I think.
Biden has to spend even more of your kids' and grandkids' credit cards. The Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski. Every day, Chris helps unpack the connection between politics and the economy and how it affects your wallet. After last week's poor GDP numbers, it's going to be much harder for businesses to grow. We don't need economists to lie for us on TV. We see stagflation on the ground. Whether it's happening in D.C. or down on Wall Street, it's affecting you financially. Be informed. Check out the Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast.
All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now. And Biden and the border continue to be a major issue for voters as well in 2024. And Biden just seems to keep doubling down. We had heard rumors, here and there, I'm going to take executive action if they don't take up the Senate bill to make it border security tougher. Well, they didn't take up the Senate bill, and Biden's done nothing on the executive front, although we have heard he's toying with more amnesty. Hasn't actually done that yet, thankfully. But he has, according to Politico, finalized a rule opening up Obamacare to DACA recipients, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals that Barack Obama illegally put forward with an executive order just before the 2012 election. So coincidence? Probably not. And so you and I are going to pay for their health care now for 100,000 of those. It says President Biden on Friday announced a final rule that will open up Obamacare plans to tens of thousands of immigrants who came to the U.S. as children but do not qualify for government health insurance because they lack legal status. Federal health officials estimate that roughly 100,000 people enrolled in the program will sign up for subsidized plans through the health insurance marketplace over the next year, under the rule which Biden proposed last year. And it says it right here. The announcement comes as Biden continues to make health care and his defense of the Affordable Care Act a centerpiece of his reelection campaign. I don't think either way it's going to be a centerpiece of this campaign in the minds of most voters. But Javier Becerra, or as Joe Biden would say, Xavier Baccaria, or whatever he called him back when he announced his nomination, we are committed to making health care accessible for all Americans, including DACA recipients. Dreamers have worked hard to live the American dream. Hopefully they should be at this point able to afford their own premiums. Jim, what do you make of the American people once again being asked to foot the bill for people who are in this country illegally? Now, these folks, not of their own volition in a lot of cases. Their parents brought them here. But nonetheless, the taxpayer's on the hook again.
Greg, where does Congressman Joe Wilson go to get his apology?
Good
For
point.
those who don't have long memories, 2009, Obama is speaking to the country, speaking to Congress about a variety of issues, but mostly trying to make the sales pitch for what became known as Obamacare. And he said that there was absolutely nothing in his reforms that would cover the health care costs of illegal immigrants. Congressman Joe Wilson of South Carolina, in what he admitted was an intemperate outburst that was not appropriate for those circumstances, shouted, "You lie!" And he was not saying his favorite month with a Latino accent. And you could see that the reaction from Biden and Obama and Pelosi, and Obama simply said he was kind of shook his head and say not true. Now later on, Obama did an interview with Gayle King on CBS Sunday Morning and said that he wanted to go down the aisle and smack him. My initial instinct is, let me walk down and smack this guy on the head. What was he thinking? And instead, I just said, that's not true, and I just move on. He called afterward to apologize, although, as I point out in the book, he saw a huge spike in campaign contributions to him from Republicans across the country who thought he had done something heroic. Now, whether or not you think it's heroic to shout while the president is giving an address to Congress, we now know he wasn't wrong. It wasn't false. It was accurate. It just took some time. Right? That once you set up the Dreamer program, once you set up this program, that eventually they say, well, we have to give them, we have to cover their health care costs. Now, if you want to make that argument, fine. If the Biden administration really thinks this is going to be a big winner. What's intriguing is if you had, say, a secure border, if you had what was seen as effective enforcement of those who have entered the country illegally as adults, if you were seeing gang members get deported, if you were seeing drug dealers get deported, if you were seeing those with criminal records get DUIs, if you're seeing all those people, I have a feeling people would be much less upset about that. There are dreamers who have genuinely inspiring stories. And yeah, there's a fair question. How much should we hold someone accountable for something that happened when they were a child and they had no control over their country, their parents bringing them into the country illegally? You could make the argument that these folks deserve a fair deal, that they deserve a chance, that we shouldn't blame them for their parents' actions. But when you say, hey, we're going to pay for all their health care, all of a sudden I think Americans will look very skeptically. And in an environment like this is a really unwise. But again, requires a philosophy towards government in which you try to work towards the middle. You kind of say, okay, there are a whole bunch of people who are sensible in the middle, who don't hate these kids, but who also aren't sure the taxpayers should be on the hook for all of their health care costs. But Biden hasn't decided that. Biden's attitude is we're going to redo the Obama 2012 campaign. We're going to try to gin up turnout amongst progressives so high that we don't need to worry about losing the independents. It's a very big gamble. It worked out in 2012. I don't know if it's going to work out this time. We'll see how it shakes out. But again, it is I think a deliberately, almost deliberately provocative approach to governing. And oh, by the way, Joe Wilson turns out was right all along.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And for the millions that have poured in under Joe Biden's presidency, as far as I know, Jim, they're getting access to free, quote unquote, healthcare as well. So it's not necessarily under Obamacare, but, from education to housing to, food and now this, it's not, I don't think it's just the DACA recipients that the taxpayers keep constantly having to foot the bill for here.
Is it Friday yet, Greg?
Yes, it is. We have earned it. So, Jim, have a great weekend. I will see you on Monday.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us again today. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you don't already and tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch Podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great weekend and join us again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.